I would like to spend the next 15 minutes or so to briefly discuss cognitive neuroscience as applied to education, in
Yeah.
particular special education, because that's where most progress has been made. This field is generally called educational neuroscience because it applies tools and methods of neuroscience to questions of importance to education. One application in educational neuroscience is dyslexia. So dyslexia is broadly defined as difficulties in language learning and skills. So for example, some children may have problems with fluent reading and writing. They otherwise have normal IQ. So the Dyslexia Association of Singapore estimates that in a class of about 40 students in Singapore, an average of 1 to 2 students will be dyslexic. There's been a long line of neuroimaging research to understand dyslexia. I'm not going to go through all of them today, but one common finding is that dyslexics, so people with dyslexia, have impairments in a particular part of the brain called the visual word form area, as shown by the arrow. This area in the left fusiform gyrus specializes in processing words in written form, and both children and adult dyslexics have reduced activation in the visual word form area compared to control subjects who can read normally. So there have been follow-up studies to test interventions that can increase activity in this area, and some of these interventions have been quite successful. This is another study in educational neuroscience that's relevant for dyslexia. It's a classic study by Morphis, published about 20 years ago. So what the author did was to collect EEG data from newborn babies when sounds were being played to their ears. So newborn babies had EEG set up, and responses of the brain were recorded when sounds were played. And then 8 years later, the same subjects were diagnosed using behavior measures. So the key point is the individuals were tracked down 8 years later and diagnosed using classic behavioral measures as either being control subjects with normal reading abilities or dyslexic, so dyslexia, or poor readers. So amazingly, when the EEG data from 8 years ago were analyzed, the pattern of electrical activity in response to sounds when they were newborn infants were quite different in the three groups. This is shown here on the right. So you can see the EEG response in control subjects shown in the big black line compared to the EEG responses of subjects with dyslexia or subjects that were poor readers in the other lines. The author was able to predict very well which group the child belonged to based on EEG patterns during infancy. So a success rate of 82%. So this opens up the possibility of using brain technology as an early tool to identify children at risk for dyslexia before they even learn to hear and write words. There are, of course, ethical issues that you have to consider, but this illustrates the power of using neuroscience as an assessment or screening tool. I'm now going to move on to dyscalculia. It's another application of cognitive neuroscience to education. Dyscalculia is the difficulty in numerical cognition, as I mentioned earlier. For example, some children have problems fluently comparing numbers or performing mathematical operations, but they are otherwise normal individuals in terms of their IQ and brain function. So again, there's been a lot of research to understand the brain basis for numbers. One particularly influential study compared, is shown here, compared control subjects, excuse me, compared control subjects with dyscalculics, so children with dyscalculia. The researchers found that controlled children who have normal numeracy have very strong activation in the back of the brain in an area called intraparietal sulcus. Yeah. That activation is absent in children with dyscalculia, shown here. If you compare this against this, there's a lot more activation in intraparietal sulcus in control subjects compared to dyscalculics. And the authors developed a training method for dyscalculics that successfully improved their numeracy skills based on behavioral tests, but also restores increased activation in IPS. This suggests a very strong coupling between brain activity and behavior. The other thing that I want to add about numerical cognition is that there's also this idea emerging that people fluent with numerical cognition, so people who can fluently compare numbers, do mathematical operations, use less of their frontal areas as they automatize mathematical operations. So children and those who are less fluent tend to use more of their frontal A regions, and the interpretation is that they tend to use more working memory and more short-term memory processes to compute numbers as opposed to children or people who are already very fluent with numbers. For example, people who can already memorize, so to speak, the times table, and they can just retrieve it from memory and don't have to depend too much on frontal cortex activation. So that's another finding that's emerged in about 10, 15 years of research, numerical.
Okay.
So it sounds counterintuitive, but basically children who are less fluent with numbers tend to exert more mental processing to process numbers using their the front part of the brain, while children who are more fluent tend to rely more on memory because it's uh, almost like second nature to them, so to speak. All right, so let's discuss again about applying neuroscience to education. I'm pleased that there have already been questions brought up, uh, along the way regarding cognition, learning, education, and so on. But if there are others, feel free to bring them up. So these are again some of the questions that I've come up with.